baseless content.
Hannibal Lecter's earliest memories were not marked by joy or carefree play, but by observation, curiosity, and a quiet intensity that set him apart from other children. From infancy, he seemed attuned to the smallest details in the world around him, the rhythm of speech, the cadence of footsteps, the subtle shifts in tone that revealed hidden meaning. While other children were absorbed in games or toys, Hannibal's attention was drawn to human behavior itself. Faces fascinated him more than objects. Gestures, glances, and even silences offered information, patterns, and insight. His parents, though cultured and educated, were not immune to the pressures and tragedies of life. They demanded refinement and propriety, expecting excellence in behavior and intellect. Hannibal, ever perceptive, recognized both the opportunity and the limitation this created. He excelled academically, absorbing language, mathematics, and the sciences with ease, but he also learned to observe the emotional undercurrents within his family. How his mother's subtle frown revealed dissatisfaction, how his father's quiet sigh betrayed frustration. These small signals became as important to him as his studies. It was during these early years that Hannibal developed an uncanny ability to conceal his darker tendencies behind charm and politeness. While other children might act impulsively or express frustration openly, Hannibal learned to mask his emotions, presenting a calm, agreeable exterior. This skill would later become one of his most powerful tools, allowing him to manipulate and observe without detection. The child who could smile while cataloging the fears and weaknesses of those around him was laying the groundwork for the predator he would one day become. Hannibal's fascination with human behavior extended to morality and justice even in childhood. He would ponder the fairness of actions, the consequences of cruelty, and the motivations behind lies or betrayals. These reflections were not moralistic in the conventional sense. They were analytical. He sought to understand not what was right or wrong, but why people acted as they did, and how their behavior could be predicted or influenced. In this way, morality itself became an object of study, a puzzle to be solved rather than a set of rules to follow. Trauma, both personal and external, played quite a significant role in shaping his emerging worldview. Even as a child, Hannibal encountered the fragility of life and the inevitability of suffering. Loss, illness, and displacement were not just abstract concepts, but lived realities, experiences that taught him both caution and calculation. He observed how grief and fear altered behavior, noting with precise clarity the responses of those around him. These early lessons in human vulnerability would later inform his understanding of fear, power, and control. Hannibal's social interactions, though outwardly congenial, were deeply analytical. He learned to read people as one might read a book, noting their motives, cataloging their behaviors, and predicting their reactions. Friendships were observed with the same meticulous attention he applied to studies and reading. He understood loyalty, envy, and affection not only as emotions but as tools for influence. By the time he entered adolescence, he was adept at manipulating perception, cultivating trust, and masking intent, skills that would serve him well in his later life. School provided Hannibal with a broader stage for observation and analysis. Teachers remarked on his brilliance, his voracious appetite for knowledge, and his refined manners, but few recognized the depth of his understanding of human psychology. He noticed hierarchies among students, the subtle power dynamics that governed social interactions, and the unspoken rules that dictated behavior. No detail escaped his attention. The nervous tapping of a hand, the fleeting glance of envy, the small concessions that revealed fear or ambition. In these observations, he was already constructing the intricate map of human behavior that would guide him for the rest of his life. Hannibal's intellectual pursuits were complemented by an equally intense curiosity about the physical world. Anatomy, physiology, and the human body fascinated him not merely as a scientific study, but as a means of understanding vulnerability and control. Where other children might experiment with mechanical toys or simple crafts, Hannibal explored the mechanics of living systems. He observed how the body responded to pain, how subtle stimuli could provoke reflexive reactions, and how physical strength or weakness could influence behavior. These early explorations were subtle, almost imperceptible to others, yet they formed a foundation for the precision and control that would later define his actions. His family environment, while nurturing in some respects, was not free from tension or subtle cruelty. Parents, siblings, and relatives displayed the same flaws and insecurities Hannibal catalogued in his peers. He noticed favoritism, disappointment, and silent judgment, internalizing the lessons of control, restraint, and observation. He began to understand that power was not simply about physical dominance, but about influence, perception, and anticipation. In these early experiences, Hannibal cultivated the skills that would make him both exceptional and dangerous. Adolescence brought new opportunities for intellectual and social refinement. Hannibal's mind matured alongside his understanding of morality, manipulation, and influence. He learned to wield charm, intellect, and observation with precision, recognizing that patience often yielded greater control than immediacy. Each conversation, each interaction became a study in causality and psychology, a chance to test theories and understand outcomes. By carefully observing the consequences of words and actions, he began to construct the mental strategies that would later allow him to orchestrate his interactions with adults, law enforcement, and society at large. Hannibal's early fascination with culture, art, and, refinement also deepened during these years. He studied music, literature, and the visual arts with a really discerning eye, seeking not merely to appreciate beauty, but to understand human creativity, emotion, and expression. He recognized that intellect and taste could enhance influence, that refinement could serve as both mask and tool. In blending aesthetic appreciation with analytical observation, he was already shaping the persona that would make him so captivating and honestly terrifying to the world. It was during these formative years that Hannibal first confronted the tension between curiosity and impulse. He understood that desire, fear, and power were, central to human motivation. While other adolescents explored these instincts, only superficially, Hannibal examined them with methodical attention. He sought to predict behavior, to manipulate circumstances, and to understand the consequences of action and inaction. In these early experiments, the seeds of his extraordinary strategic mind were sown, a mind capable of planning, executing, and anticipating outcomes with exceptional foresight. By the end of his adolescence, Hannibal Lecter had become a man apart from his peers. His intellect, observation, and social skill were extraordinary, but they were coupled with a growing awareness of his own capacity for control and influence. He had mastered the art of concealment, of masking true intention behind charm and refinement, while at the same time developing a profound understanding of fear, desire, and human weakness. These years forged the duality that would define him throughout his life. The coexistence of civility and menace, genius and darkness, intellect and appetite. In reflecting upon Hannibal's early life, it becomes clear that the origins of his mind lie not in any single event, but in the cumulative effect of observation, experience, intellect, and, reflection. Each interaction, each lesson, each insight contributed to a foundation upon which he would later build a persona of extraordinary sophistication and, honestly, terrifying capability. He was not born a monster, nor was he simply a product of circumstance. He was forged in the quiet, subtle ways that only the most perceptive can recognize. A mind both brilliant and inexorably dark, capable of understanding humans in ways they could not understand themselves. Hannibal Lecter's childhood and adolescence reveal a paradox that would define his life. The fusion of refinement and cruelty, empathy and detachment, intellect and appetite. From the earliest years he observed the world with, the precision of a scientist, catalogued human behavior with the rigor of a scholar, and refined his understanding of influence, control, and anticipation. These formative experiences, layered and complex, provided the foundation for the extraordinary man he would become, a man whose genius and darkness were inseparable, whose understanding of humanity was profound, and whose life would challenge our very notions of morality, intelligence, and evil. Hannibal Lecter's formative years in formal education were as much about mastering the human mind as they were about mastering academic subjects. By adolescence, he had already cultivated an extraordinary capacity for observation, subtle manipulation, and calculation. Yet it was within the structured environment of schooling and later medical education that these skills were refined into precision, discipline, and deliberate strategy. From the earliest stages of secondary education, Lecter distinguished himself not only by intellect, but by his uncanny ability to read people. Classrooms became laboratories. Every interaction, every debate, and even the casual gossip of his peers was catalogued with meticulous care. He noted how classmates responded to praise or criticism, how teachers' moods shifted with small provocations, and how social hierarchies dictated behavior. Hannibal did not merely learn, he analyzed, predicted, and adapted. He understood that knowledge without perception was incomplete, and that influence required both intellect and insight. Mathematics, science, and the natural sciences were absorbed effortlessly, yet it was in the humanities that Hannibal's mind revealed its true complexity. Literature offered him insight into human motivation and moral ambiguity, history revealed patterns of behavior across time, and philosophy exposed the contradictions, weaknesses, and strengths inherent in human reasoning. But Hannibal's study of these subjects was never purely academic. Each novel, historical account, and philosophical argument became a case study in human behavior. Characters were dissected psychologically. Historical figures were analyzed for pattern, strategy, and foresight. Even as a young man, Lecter approached life with the mind of both scholar and strategist. University accelerated this process. Once immersed in medical studies, he approached anatomy, physiology, and pathology with a precision that few peers could match. Where others viewed cadavers and clinical cases as opportunities to memorize or practice, Hannibal saw a combination of mechanism and vulnerability. He examined each patient, each body, and each symptom not just for its medical significance, but for what it revealed about fear, resilience, and human psychology. How a person reacted to pain, stress, or constraint was, in his mind, as revealing as a psychological profile. Each observation became another layer of understanding, another data point in his mental framework of control. It was in psychiatric education that Hannibal's fascination with the human mind, reached its zenith. He recognized early on that psychiatry was less about treatment than it was about understanding the underlying mechanisms of behavior. He studied compulsions, obsessions, and anxieties with a clinical interest, but also, with an instinct for manipulation. He noted how guilt, desire, and fear could influence decisions, and he began to develop methods for predicting and shaping behavior. Each patient was both a subject and a teacher, every session a lesson in nuance, subtlety, and the malleability of the human psyche. Lecter's mentors were often impressed by his intelligence, but honestly, unaware of the depth of his observation. He would absorb lectures, clinical notes, and discussions while simultaneously studying the instructors themselves. Their hesitations, their biases, their personal inconsistencies, all were noted with meticulous care. He learned not just the science of psychiatry, but the psychology of those who practiced it. By the time he completed his studies, Hannibal had already mastered techniques of perception, influence, and social strategy. that would later allow him to manipulate even the most experienced professionals with apparent ease. Hannibal's fascination with human behavior was complemented by a growing sophistication in cultural and aesthetic refinement. Music, art, and literature were not mere hobbies. They were, in fact, tools for understanding human emotion and cultivating influence. He studied composition to understand emotional cadence, visual art to understand symmetry, pattern, and perception, and literature to dissect character and motive. Each work became a lesson in precision and taste, sharpening his ability to observe, critique, and influence both subtly and powerfully. For Hannibal, sophistication was inseparable from strategy. It was a form of control, an instrument to shape perception before ever taking action. During this time, Hannibal also began what could only be described as psychological experiments on those around him. He would test hypotheses, often imperceptibly, to observe human reaction and behavior. A peer's nervous glance might reveal hidden fear. A colleague's hesitation might indicate guilt or insecurity. A subtle suggestion could provoke compliance or defiance. These tests were rarely overt. They were woven into conversation, small gestures, and social interactions. In effect, Hannibal was practicing manipulation as both art and science, training himself to anticipate responses, predict outcomes, and shape perception without detection. Lecter's early experiments were not cruel for their own sake. They were exercises in understanding. He sought patterns, causality, and control. He observed reactions to stress, ambiguity, and moral dilemmas, always measuring the interplay between instinct and intellect. Through these experiments, Hannibal refined an extraordinary intuition for human behavior, capable of predicting responses and manipulating circumstances with extraordinary subtlety. By the time he entered his final years of education, he had already achieved mastery over both knowledge and perception. In addition to his psychological studies, Hannibal developed a precise sense of personal discipline and ritual. His habits were methodical, his attention to detail extended from intellectual pursuits to daily routine. He recognized that mastery of self was inseparable from mastery of circumstance. The precision of movement, speech, and thought became a form of armor, a tool for influence, and a manifestation of the order he sought to impose upon the world. Control over the self translated naturally into control over others, and he honed this skill with a meticulous, almost obsessive attention. Ethics and morality became subjects of fascination as well. Hannibal did not approach morality in conventional terms. He studied it as a system of behavior, a construct that could be observed, manipulated, and applied strategically. He became fascinated by contradictions in human behavior, the ways in which desire conflicted with duty, and the moments when fear overcame logic. These insights, cultivated through study and observation, allowed him to navigate social and professional environments with extraordinary skill. By understanding not just what people did, but why they did it, Hannibal could predict, influence, and, when necessary, exploit behavior. It was also during his education that Hannibal's fascination with refinement and culture deepened into something uniquely strategic. Elegance, taste, and sophistication were not mere affectations. They were tools of influence. A well-placed remark, a subtle display of knowledge, a deliberate aesthetic choice, all served to shape perception. Hannibal understood that power often lay not in brute force, but in the control of attention, expectation, and perception. Culture became a language through which he communicated intellect, refinement, and authority without overt demonstration. By the end of his formal education, Hannibal Lecter had evolved from a precocious child into a man of extraordinary intellect, discipline, and strategic awareness. His mastery of psychiatry, combined with his acute perception, cultural sophistication, and cultivated charm, provided him with tools that would allow him to navigate human society with unparalleled subtlety. He had become both a student and an architect of human behavior, capable of observing, predicting, and influencing with extraordinary precision. The mind of Dr. Hannibal Lecter was no longer simply bright. It was formidable, methodical, and preternaturally attuned to the interplay between intellect, desire, and control. The culmination of his education did not merely mark the acquisition of degrees or clinical credentials. It signified the forging of a mind capable of extraordinary calculation, subtlety, and influence. Lecter had mastered observation, psychology, aesthetics, and discipline. He had cultivated charm, intellect, and strategic insight. He understood fear, desire, and morality, and he had learned to navigate the intricate interplay of these forces in both individuals and groups. The foundation was complete. The making of Dr. Hannibal Lecter was no longer a process in progress. It had reached a state of readiness, a mind prepared to engage the world with unmatched sophistication, insight, and, ultimately, subtle menace. Hannibal Lecter's cultivation of civility was not merely a social convenience. It was a comprehensive system of interaction, meticulously designed to manipulate perception while concealing the full depth of his intellect and psychological acuity. From the earliest stages of his professional life, he understood that the human mind was not only a subject of study, but also a medium of influence. Civility allowed him to move freely through the world, observing, interpreting, and controlling interactions without attracting suspicion. The mask he wore was, in effect, an instrument of power, a precise interface between his mind and the social environment. In professional settings, Hannibal's behavior was almost ritualistic. Meetings, consultations, and conferences were opportunities to display competence, refinement, and charm, while simultaneously gathering insight into human behavior. He listened attentively, posed seemingly casual questions, and offered observations that appeared thoughtful but were strategically designed to elicit reactions. In this way, Hannibal transformed ordinary interactions into subtle exercises in influence and intelligence gathering. Colleagues and patients alike were unaware that the polite, cultured man before them was silently cataloging micro-expressions, speech patterns, and behavioral tendencies. This mastery extended to hierarchy and authority. Hannibal understood the dynamics of power within any social structure, professional, academic, or cultural. He observed the subtle cues of superiority and subordination, noting how respect, fear, and admiration could be leveraged. He learned that authority could be acknowledged, challenged, or manipulated depending on timing, demeanor, and the skillful application of charm. Civility was both shield and weapon. It allowed him to navigate hierarchies with apparent respect while secretly controlling perception and anticipating responses. Lecter's interactions were always multidimensional. A conversation could serve multiple purposes simultaneously: to extract information, to inspire trust, to observe reaction, and to reinforce his cultivated persona. He understood the human tendency to underestimate those who appeared polite, cultured, and measured. By projecting refinement, he created a false sense of security, lulling others into revealing themselves, their weaknesses, and their motivations. Civility was a lure, an analytical tool, and a strategy of concealment all at once. The depth of Hannibal's observation was extraordinary. He noticed the minutiae of human behavior, a flicker of anxiety in the eyes, a hesitant gesture, the subtle inflection in a voice. These observations were not incidental. They were systematically recorded in his mind, forming a mental database of behavior, emotion, and motivation. Civility enabled him to observe without interference, to mask curiosity with charm, and to interpret the world through a lens of refined calculation. Every smile, nod, and gesture was both genuine and purposeful, calibrated to maintain social harmony while advancing his understanding of those around him. This strategic civility was complemented by Hannibal's profound cultural and aesthetic sophistication. Music, literature, art, and cuisine were not merely pursuits of pleasure. They were extensions of his identity, instruments of influence, and, subtle tools for psychological engagement. Hannibal understood that aesthetic appreciation could signal intelligence, refinement, and taste, and he leveraged this to shape perception. A casually mentioned author, a recommended symphony, or an elegantly prepared meal could convey intellect and cultural capital, subtly guiding others to respond with admiration or trust. In these cultivated experiences, civility became really inseparable from power. Hannibal's charm was equally tactical. He displayed empathy when it advanced trust, warmth when it inspired openness, and subtle humor when it disarmed tension. These behaviors were not spontaneous. They were deliberate choices, carefully calculated to achieve specific outcomes. He recognized that social influence relied not only on intellect, but on emotional resonance. And he, meticulously honed the ability to project the precise emotional tone required in any interaction. Civility was a language, and Hannibal was a fluent speaker, able to modulate expression to achieve desired results while concealing his full capacity for insight and manipulation. The mask of civility also functioned as a psychological shield. Hannibal understood that visibility of thought or impulse could invite scrutiny, judgment, or even opposition. By maintaining a composed, polished exterior, he insulated his intentions, preserving freedom of action and, the ability to think without interference. This discipline of presentation allowed him to operate with precision, executing plans, testing hypotheses, and observing responses without the disruption of suspicion or emotional interference. Civility became a form of self-mastery, ensuring that intellect and strategy remained unimpeded by impulse or, honestly, unpredictability. Social interactions were, laboratories for Hannibal's mind. Every encounter, whether it was a casual conversation or a professional engagement, was analyzed for information, tested for reaction, and used to refine his understanding of human behavior. Subtle suggestions, the careful use of praise or critique, and the timing of remarks allowed him to influence others without their awareness. Civility was the conduit through which observation became influence, insight became leverage, and social dynamics became, predictable. Hannibal's refinement extended beyond intellect and social skill to encompass personal rituals and lifestyle choices. His diet, attire, personal grooming, and environment were carefully curated, reinforcing the perception of control, sophistication, and taste. These choices were not superficial. They were elements of his persona that communicated power, intellect, and stability to those who encountered him. Civility, taste, and precision were inseparable in his daily life, forming a holistic system that guided interaction, perception, and influence. Even in moments of conflict or danger, the mask of civility remained intact. Hannibal's calm demeanor, measured speech, and deliberate gestures concealed any internal calculation, tension, or intent. He understood that the appearance of control often shaped outcomes more effectively than the exercise of overt power. Civility in this sense was both strategy and armor, enabling him to navigate risk, maintain influence, and observe without interference. The mask of civility also allowed Hannibal to integrate seamlessly into multiple social spheres. In professional contexts, he could inspire trust and admiration among colleagues and superiors. In social or cultural contexts, he could cultivate charm and sophistication that drew attention, respect, and emotional engagement. Even in intimate or vulnerable encounters, he maintained the balance between authenticity and performance, allowing glimpses of warmth or intellect without revealing the full depth of his calculations. Civility was adaptive, versatile, and indispensable, a constant in an unpredictable world. Underlying this persona was a mind of extraordinary observation and calculation. Hannibal catalogued every detail, from micro-expressions to patterns of speech, noting not only individual tendencies but also group dynamics, hierarchies, and vulnerabilities. Civility allowed him to observe without interference, influencing subtly while remaining imperceptible. It was simultaneously armor and instrument, a framework through which the world could be engaged, understood, and, when necessary, manipulated. Hannibal's mastery of civility was thus inseparable from his mastery of mind. The mask of civility also reflected a philosophical understanding of human nature. Hannibal recognized that morality, desire, and intellect were intertwined in complex, often contradictory ways. He understood that outward appearances were frequently deceptive, that social expectations could be leveraged, and that influence often depended on subtlety rather than force. Civility, charm, and sophistication were not ends in themselves. They were strategies, tools, and reflections of a mind that sought both comprehension and control. In mastering this interface between appearance and reality, Hannibal achieved a level of social and psychological dominance rarely observed in human behavior. By the time Hannibal Lecter fully entered the professional world, the mask of civility was complete. It allowed him to operate with confidence, intelligence, and subtlety. It protected his intentions, facilitated influence, and enabled the precise observation of human behavior on an extraordinary scale. Civility became the defining lens through which the world viewed him, even as it concealed the extraordinary depths of intellect, insight, and calculation beneath. In mastering this balance, Hannibal Lecter demonstrated that the most formidable power often lies not in force but in perception, influence, and the strategic performance of refinement. The mask of civility, in essence, was both an instrument and a shield, a deliberate construction that enabled Hannibal to navigate complex social, professional, and psychological landscapes with extraordinary precision. It allowed him to observe without interference, influence without detection, and engage with society while concealing the full depth of his capabilities. This duality, refinement and calculation, civility and strategy, would define him for the remainder of his life, providing the framework for the extraordinary influence, manipulation, and control that would come to characterize the man known to the world as Dr. Hannibal Lecter. Hannibal Lecter's adolescent years formed the crucible in which the sharp steel of his intellect was forged. If childhood had given him the early instruments of observation and discipline, then his adolescence honed those tools into weapons, quiet, invisible, and devastatingly effective. It was during this period of his life that he grew into the persona that the world would come to know, the cultivated gentleman, the refined scholar, the young man who could speak softly while bending a room to his will. To those around him, Hannibal was not merely intelligent, he was prodigious. Teachers noted with both admiration and, well, a bit of unease that he could absorb entire volumes of literature with near photographic precision. He could recall details from lessons given months earlier, recite passages from memory, and dissect philosophical arguments with the ease of a seasoned academic. But while most prodigies basked in praise or sought validation from their mentors, Hannibal did something altogether different. He observed his instructors themselves. He watched the way one teacher faltered when challenged by students, the nervous tapping of fingers betraying insecurity. Another, though stern and commanding in tone, revealed her deep longing for approval when students offered smiles or nods of agreement. Hannibal catalogued these weaknesses, storing them in the vault of his memory. He did not mock or belittle them aloud. On the contrary, he cultivated respect and charm. But within himself, he measured the fragility of authority and recognized how easily it could be manipulated. What set Hannibal apart was not merely his brilliance, but his silence. He spoke when necessary, never more. While other boys filled classrooms with chatter, his words were chosen carefully, each one carrying the weight of precision. In conversation, he possessed an unnerving ability to listen intently, to fix his gaze upon a speaker in such a way that they felt simultaneously understood and dissected. Adults praised his maturity. Peers sometimes feared it. To sit across from Hannibal Lecter in conversation was to feel both validated and vulnerable. This silence was not emptiness. It was the fertile ground where his mind thrived. In moments when others sought noise, Hannibal sought understanding. He dissected silence itself, learning how pauses unsettled people, how waiting too long to respond could draw secrets from the lips of the impatient. Where most viewed silence as an absence, Hannibal wielded it as a scalpel, precise and cutting. Books became his constant companions. He devoured philosophy, literature, medical texts, and histories. He read of Marcus Aurelius, of Machiavelli, of Dante and Shakespeare. From these works, he absorbed not just knowledge but frameworks, ways of thinking about morality, power, and the human soul. He saw in Machiavelli the calculated pragmatism that would one day guide his own manipulations. He studied Dante's Inferno and pondered the nature of punishment, the poetic symmetry of sin and retribution. Yet Hannibal did not merely read, he interpreted. He questioned whether morality was truly universal, or whether it was a construct shaped by circumstance and fear. He considered whether cruelty was inherent or learned, whether beauty could exist in brutality, and whether violence, when executed with elegance, might transcend the grotesque to become something closer to art. It was during this time that Hannibal's fascination with anatomy deepened. The human body, to him, was not simply flesh and bone, but an intricate machine of extraordinary beauty. He studied diagrams with obsessive focus, memorizing the location of every tendon, every nerve, every vein. What fascinated him most was the duality of it all, that a body could be so resilient, capable of enduring pain and hardship, and yet so fragile, undone by the smallest disruption to its systems. Dissection became less an academic exercise and more a meditation. While his peers recoiled from the sight of blood or the smell of preserved organs, Hannibal leaned in, curious and unflinching. He traced the architecture of muscle and sinew as though studying a symphony composed not of notes, but of tissue. He learned where pressure could silence a heartbeat, where a blade could sever life without chaos, where fragility lay hidden beneath the illusion of strength. These were not idle curiosities. They were rehearsals, quiet rehearsals for a stage he had not yet stepped onto. Still, Hannibal's outward life seemed pristine. He excelled in languages, in history, and science. He demonstrated a refined taste for music, preferring the intricacies of Bach and the emotional swell of Mozart over the simplicity of popular tunes. He carried himself with a poise that belied his years, a sophistication that made him appear older than his peers. When others stumbled awkwardly through adolescence, Hannibal seemed untouched by the clumsy transition. His presence, even as a teenager, exuded composure. But within this calm lay something darker. The silence of genius masked the storm of questions swirling inside him. He wondered not only about how life functioned, but about how it could be ended. He considered not just how humans survived, but how they broke, physically, emotionally, spiritually. He became increasingly aware of the thin line between respect and fear, between admiration and submission. He realized that intellect could command as effectively as violence, and that the most effective power often required neither raised voices nor raised hands. It was also during these years that Hannibal began to test the boundaries of his influence. A classmate, struggling with lessons, confided in him. Hannibal offered help, guiding the boy through the material with patience and kindness. Yet beneath this benevolence he probed. He asked subtle questions, learned of the boy's insecurities, his frustrations at home, his envy of others. Weeks later, Hannibal made a quiet remark in passing, just enough to stir those insecurities, to spark an argument with another student. No one suspected Hannibal's role. He had planted a seed, and then stepped back to observe its growth. For him, it was an experiment, a lesson in the pliability of human emotion. Such experiments grew more refined over time. He learned to provoke without accusation, to guide without detection. He saw that silence, when coupled with observation, allowed others to reveal themselves. People often spoke to fill the void of quiet, and in doing so, they exposed secrets they had not intended to share. Hannibal's genius lay not only in what he said, but in what he allowed others to say to him. In these formative years, Hannibal Lecter built the foundation of the persona that would later terrify and fascinate the world. A boy of extraordinary intellect, cloaked in silence, drawn to anatomy and philosophy, capable of charm and manipulation in equal measure. To outsiders, he was a prodigy destined for greatness. To himself, he was something far more complex, a craftsman refining his tools, a conductor tuning the instruments of a symphony he would one day orchestrate with human lives. And yet, though the seeds of his future were sown, he had not yet stepped fully into the shadows. The silence of his genius was not yet the silence of his crimes. That transition, as inevitable as it was chilling, would come in time. But for now, Hannibal Lecter was still a student, absorbing, cataloging, and preparing for the moment when intellect and impulse would merge into something the world was not ready to confront. Hannibal Lecter's adolescence was not simply a time of study and observation. Beneath the layers of refinement and brilliance, there began to stir something deeper, more primal and more enduring. His intellect had sharpened, his philosophies had broadened, and his understanding of human fragility had matured. But now, another element entered into his life, an awakening of appetite. Not merely the appetite for food, though gastronomy would become a defining hallmark of his identity. This was an appetite for sensation, for experience, for mastery. Where others felt hunger in the body, Hannibal felt it in the mind, in the very marrow of his being. His was an appetite not just for sustenance, but for control. It began, as many things did for him, in subtlety. Hannibal had long possessed a refined palate. Even as a boy, he distinguished flavors with a precision that startled adults. He could taste the faintest hint of saffron in a dish, the shadow of a spice that lingered beneath the dominant flavors. While other children recoiled from bitterness or strong herbs, Hannibal embraced them, savoring their complexity. Meals were never mere necessities for him, they were opportunities for meditation. He studied the textures of meat, the interplay of sweet and savory, the layers of aroma that rose from a well-prepared dish. Food for Hannibal was an education in itself. He read of French cuisine, of ancient recipes preserved through generations. He experimented when he could, replicating dishes with a precision that revealed not just talent, but devotion. In the act of cooking, Hannibal discovered a kind of art that satisfied his need for creation. Unlike dissection, which reduced life to anatomy, cooking transformed flesh into beauty. It was the same body, the same raw material, but guided by skill, it became elevated. It was art disguised as sustenance. Yet his appetite did not end with food. He hungered for music, losing himself in compositions that spoke not to the surface of emotion, but to the depths of human complexity. Bach, with his intricate mathematics of sound, became a mirror for Hannibal's own mind, ordered, structured, yet endlessly creative. Mozart stirred in him a joy that bordered on reverence. Each note carried weight, each silence between notes carried meaning. In music, Hannibal found not only beauty but discipline. The precision of timing, the balance of harmony, mirrored the balance he sought in all things. Art, too, captivated him. He gazed at Renaissance paintings, marveling not only at their beauty but at their construction. He saw how light shaped perception, how shadows concealed and revealed, how faces could betray divinity or deceit depending on the hand that painted them. To Hannibal, art was not static, it was alive, breathing meaning into the mind of the observer. And in art, as in cuisine, as in music, he saw the reflection of control. A great artist, a great composer, a great chef. Each was a master over their medium, bending matter, sound, or flavor into submission. Hannibal longed for that same mastery, not only over objects, but over life itself. But beneath this cultivated appetite for beauty, a darker hunger was beginning to grow. The world around Hannibal remained filled with cruelty and imperfection. He still carried within him the scars of his earliest losses, the memory of helplessness, the knowledge of what it meant to be a victim. That knowledge festered not as weakness but as fuel. He would never be powerless again. His appetites demanded more than observation, they demanded expression. The first stirrings of this darker appetite revealed themselves not in grand gestures, but in quiet, calculated moments. A classmate insulted him in jest, seeking laughter from peers. Hannibal smiled, unbothered on the surface. But weeks later, that same boy found himself isolated, shunned by others. His own secrets whispered at the right moments to the right ears. Hannibal had not raised a hand, yet he had orchestrated a downfall. The pleasure Hannibal felt was not merely in revenge, but in the artistry of it, the precision with which he turned words into weapons, silence into a blade sharper than steel. Over time, these small exercises became more deliberate. Hannibal began to test not only the pliability of people's emotions, but also the boundaries of morality itself. He pondered what it meant to cross the invisible lines society had drawn, and whether such lines had any inherent meaning at all. If beauty could be found in music, in art, in cuisine, could it not also be found in cruelty, if executed with elegance? Could violence itself, when stripped of chaos and delivered with precision, become a form of art? This was not yet the Hannibal Lecter who would become infamous, but the outlines were forming. His appetite was no longer confined to books, to flavors, to compositions. It was turning toward life itself. He wanted to know not only how humans lived, but how they could be unmade. He wanted to understand the boundary between suffering and serenity, between life and death, and, whether mastery over another's fate could be as profound as mastery over a canvas or a sonata. Still, Hannibal did not rush. His was not the appetite of recklessness, but of patience. He savored anticipation, the slow unfolding of desire. To act too soon, to indulge without restraint would be, well, vulgar. True appetite required discipline, timing, and, the ability to wait until the perfect moment revealed itself. For now, his expressions remained subtle, hidden beneath the polished veneer of a cultured youth. He played the role of prodigy, of refined student, of charming conversationalist. Adults praised him, peers respected him, and honestly, few suspected the currents beneath his calm surface. Hannibal's genius was not only that he concealed his growing appetite, but that he transformed it into a mask of civility so convincing that no one looked too closely. In truth, his appetite had awakened, and it would never again be silent. It whispered to him in the quiet hours of the night. It hummed beneath the strains of music. It lingered at the edges of his thoughts as he dissected anatomy or, savored a carefully prepared dish. It told him that beauty was not confined to what the world accepted. It told him that creation and destruction were not opposites, but companions. It told him that one day he would step beyond the boundaries of silent genius into the realm of action. That day had not yet come, but it was drawing nearer with every book, every taste, every observation. Hannibal Lecter's appetite had awakened, and it would shape the course of his life forever. By the time Hannibal Lecter stepped into early adulthood, he had already absorbed the greatest lesson that survival and dominance required: to conceal one's true nature beneath a carefully crafted mask. The world was filled with people who survived by instinct or by brute force. But Hannibal was different. He understood that control did not lie in raw strength or reckless violence. It lay in elegance, in patience, in the performance of refinement. The mask he fashioned for himself was not one of falsehood, but of selective truth. The mask of civility. Civility was more than a disguise. It was a philosophy. Hannibal recognized early that the crude and the vulgar drew suspicion, while the refined drew admiration. A man of manners, of cultivated tastes, of intellectual brilliance, could go anywhere, speak to anyone, and remain unquestioned. His own talents, his gift for language, his command of history, his meticulous intellect were not simply personal strengths. They were the raw materials from which he built the facade that would shield him for life. Hannibal's civility was not shallow imitation. He truly loved music, literature, and art. The sound of Bach stirred something in him that nothing else could. The brushstrokes of Titian and Caravaggio captivated him in a way that violence never could. When he recited lines of Dante in the original Italian or quoted Seneca in Latin, there was no falsehood in his knowledge. Yet it was not love of beauty alone that drove him to these pursuits. It was the recognition that beauty was power. To understand refinement, to display it effortlessly, was to disarm suspicion. At university, Hannibal's mask of civility was put to its first rigorous test. He entered the lecture halls of Paris, and later the polished corridors of medical school, not as a survivor of war, not as the orphan who had once known starvation and cruelty, but as a prodigy of intellect and poise. His professors marveled at his precision, the way his scalpel cut with absolute certainty during dissections, the way he could recall obscure anatomical details without hesitation, the way he treated the dead with an almost reverential calm. To his peers, however, Hannibal was an enigma. They could not decide whether to admire him or fear him. Some were drawn to him by his knowledge, his wit, and his understated charm. He never sought attention, yet it seemed to find him. Others found his perfection unsettling, as though no man could be so precise, so disciplined without hiding something beneath the surface. And Hannibal noted all of it: the arrogance of a wealthy student who thought money excused incompetence, the insecurity of another who masked his failures with loud jokes, the desperation of a young woman who longed for validation from her professors. To Hannibal, They were instruments, and he was already learning how to play them. One of Hannibal's most effective weapons was silence. When another student boasted, Hannibal would listen quietly, his face unreadable, allowing the speaker's own insecurities to fester in the void of his response. When challenged in debate, he rarely argued loudly. Instead, he waited, then dismantled his opponent's position with a single precise observation, delivered so calmly that it left the room in stunned silence. This too was civility, the refusal to indulge in base argument, the patience to let others expose themselves, the composure to strike only when the moment was perfect. Hannibal discovered that people revealed more about themselves when confronted with silence than with words. In silence, they filled the void with confessions, with fears, with unguarded truths. Civility, however, was not merely restraint, it was also performance. Hannibal knew when to smile, when to offer a compliment, when to draw another person into a conversation with just the right balance of curiosity and deference. He cultivated relationships with professors by asking questions that revealed not only his intellect, but also his appreciation of their expertise. He flattered without flattery, his respect seeming entirely genuine. And in many ways it was genuine, for Hannibal admired knowledge and mastery wherever he found it. To his peers, he was more selective. He befriended those who could be useful, offering help with studies, guiding them through complex material, or listening attentively to their complaints. Yet his friendship always carried an invisible barrier. He gave just enough warmth to inspire loyalty, but never enough vulnerability to allow true intimacy. To the few who thought they were close to him, Hannibal remained unknowable, a mirror reflecting back only what they wished to see. The deeper Hannibal sank into his studies, the more he realized the true value of his mask. Civility disarmed suspicion, politeness concealed sharpness, refinement allowed him to slip past scrutiny. When others were questioned, Hannibal was trusted. When others faltered, Hannibal was praised. No one looked at him and saw danger. They saw discipline, intellect, and promise. And this, Hannibal knew, was the irony of society. The very quality it prized most, the appearance of refinement, could also serve as the perfect camouflage for predation. Hannibal did not need to snarl or threaten. He needed only to smile, to nod, to speak with elegance. In doing so, he became invisible, even as he stood in plain sight. In private, the mask slipped, though never fully. Alone, Hannibal allowed himself the pleasure of reflection. He considered the duality of his existence, the gentleman admired for his intellect, and the predator waiting for the perfect moment to reveal himself. This duality did not trouble him, it delighted him. To wear the mask was to prove his superiority, not simply because he could hide his appetites, but because he could control them. Hannibal despised those whose cruelty erupted without discipline. The brutish soldiers who had destroyed his childhood home, the men who laughed as they stole, burned, and killed, they were slaves to appetite, nothing more than animals. Hannibal's own cruelty, when it came, would be deliberate, restrained, and exquisite. His mask of civility ensured that when he struck, it would not be with the chaos of instinct, but with the precision of design. As years passed, Hannibal's mask ceased to feel like a disguise. It became part of him, fused with his identity, until even he no longer separated performance from self. He was not pretending to be a man of refinement, he was a man of refinement. Yet beneath that refinement lived the predator, patient and alert. Others admired him without suspicion. Professors saw a rising star. Patrons of the arts saw a cultured young man of impeccable taste. Peers saw someone brilliant, if aloof, destined for greatness. None suspected the truth. None imagined that beneath the civility they so admired lay a hunger sharpened by loss, a desire honed by intellect, a predator cloaked in elegance. Hannibal knew the truth. He knew that the mask of civility would be his greatest creation, the masterpiece upon which all his future work would depend. Behind it, he could observe without notice, plan without interference, and act without consequence. And so, with perfect calm, Hannibal Lecter resolved that he would never remove it. The world, after all, had always underestimated him, and Hannibal, behind the finest mask of all, was prepared to ensure that it always would.